effect, Russia has been for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't you just take it when you became president 24 years ago? You have nuclear weapons, they don't. If it's actually your land, why did you wait so long?
Sure.
The Soviet Ukraine received a great deal of territory that had never belonged to it, including the Black Sea region. Russia received those lands as a result, as an outcome of the Russian-Turkish wars, and they were called New Russia or Novorossiya. But that doesn't matter. But actually Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, gave Ukraine its own territory, and for decades the Ukrainian Soviet Republic was part of the USSR. And to unknown reasons, the Bolsheviks promoted the Ukrainian culture and language. Ukrainization was called, and similar things were done in other Soviet republics. The ethnic profiles of those republics were raised and promoted. This is how Soviet Ukraine was created, and after the Second World War, Ukraine received part of the lands that had belonged to Poland before, and part of the land that had belonged to Hungary and Romania before. So Romania and Hungary were deprived of part of their lands, and these lands were snatched and given to Ukraine, and now they're still part of Ukraine. So in this sense, Ukraine is an artificial state that was established.
Hungary has a right to take its land back from Ukraine, and that other nations have a right to go back to their 1654 borders?
Well, I'm not sure whether it should come back to the 1654, but if anyone believes, and everyone believes, that the Stalin regime rule saw a lot of violations of human rights and violation of the rights of other nations. In this sense, actually, one can state that they may have a right to claim those lands back.
Have you told Viktor Orban that he can have part of Ukraine?
Never. I've never told him. I've never told him. Not a single time. Never. We haven't even had any conversation on that. But I actually know for sure.
Of course, the Hungarians who live over there, they want to get back to their historical land. Moreover, just an interesting anecdote, a personal one, I would like to share with you. Let me divert a little bit. Somewhere in the 80s, I think I went on a road trip through the USSR from Leningrad on a car via Kiev, then I went to western Ukraine. I went to the town of Beregovoye, and all the names of the cities and towns over there are were in Russian, and also in one language I didn't understand. It was Hungarian, it was not Ukrainian. Now, as for the NATO expansion eastwards, they promised us that they wouldn't move an inch to the east, but it was not enshrined on paper. So there were 5 waves of expansion. And the Baltic states did join, and Eastern Europe in general. And now I'm coming to the crux of the matter. They came to Ukraine. In 2008, at the Bucharest summit, a statement was made saying that the doors were open to Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. Now, as far as decisions are made in NATO, Germany, France allegedly were against, some other countries, European countries. But, President Bush is a very tough guy. And as I was told afterward, I was told that he had exerted pressure on them and they had to acquiesce. So it's like in a kindergarten, where are the guarantees? Who are they? They got under some pressure and they had to agree. Okay, but then they say, Ukraine is never going to join NATO. And I say, I know that you agreed to open the doors to Ukraine in 2008. There is no guarantee that you're not going to do the same sometime in the future. So I don't know whom to talk to over there. We are willing to talk, but who to? Whether regarding the guarantees, no guarantees at all.
And they started entering the Ukrainian soil. This was the full history about how that territory developed and what relationship they had with Russia. Each second or third person there has had ties with Russia. So when the elections happened in the new sovereign Ukraine as a result of the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine that said that Ukraine was a neutral state, but all of a sudden in 2008 NATO doors were opened to that. So it's so interesting, but we hadn't agreed to that. We didn't come to terms on that. All presidents that rose to power in Ukraine relied on voters, on the electorate that had a good relationship and a good attitude to Russia. The southeast of Ukraine had always had a good attitude to Russia. And, you know, it was very difficult to dissuade this electorate. And Mr. Yanukovych rose to power afterwards there. He won the election after Kuchma, and the rerun was organized. There was not enshrined in Ukrainian constitution. This was a coup, actually, a coup d'etat. Just imagine someone in the United States wouldn't like the outcome. No, prior to that, before. So after President Kuchma retired, Yanukovych won the election, but his opponents did not acknowledge his victory, and the United States backed the opposition, and a rerun was held, which actually was virtually a coup d'etat, and the United States backed that. And as a result of this rerun, like fancy someone doesn't like the outcome of the American election and a rerun happens that is not enshrined in the American Constitution. So Viktor Yushchenko rose to power in Ukraine. He was a pro-Western politician. Well, anyway, we established some working contacts with him. He came to visit us and we went to Kiev. We had meetings informally also. Well, let them be pro-Western, okay? Let them do what they want. They should have their own domestic developments independently. You know, after he ruled that country, things deteriorated there. And as a result, Yanukovych once again came to power. He may not have been the best president. I'm not sure. I wouldn't like to give any assessments. But, you know, the matter of the association with the EU was brought up. We always were quite loyal on that. Okay. But when we read the draft agreement, it turned to be a problem for us because us and Ukraine had a free trade area, an open customs borders, and Ukraine had, according to that association agreement, opened their borders to Europe, and that would float our market duty-less. And then we said we'll close our borders with Ukraine, our customs. And Yanukovych started doing his reckoning and counting whether Ukraine will lose or gain, and he stated to his Ukrainian counterparts that he had to think, and destructive opposition activity began straight away, and it ended up with Maidan, with a coup d'etat in Ukraine.
So he did more trade with Russia than with the EU? Ukraine did?
Yes, of course, of course. It's not about the volumes of trade, the quantities. It's about the cooperation ties that the Ukrainian economy relied upon. And those cooperation ties between enterprises and factories had been there since the Soviet times, like an enterprise would produce components for final assembly, both plants in Ukraine and Russia, and there was very close cooperation, but a coup d'etat happened afterwards. It was perpetrated, and unfortunately, well, I wouldn't like to speak of details, but the United States said, you calm Yanukovych down and you would mollify the opposition. They said, let it drift. They said, towards a political settlement. We said, okay, we are in agreement with that, let it be so. And Yanukovych checked to apply for armed forces or police, while the armed opposition in Kyiv perpetrated a coup d'etat. How can I reckon that and assess that? Who are you, I asked the United
With the
States.
backing of whom? The trigger for you? What was the moment where you decided you had to do this? Well, the trigger originally, the trigger was the coup d'etat in Ukraine, and representatives of 3 European nations came then, Germany, Poland and France, and they acted as guarantors of the agreement subscribed between Yanukovych and the opposition, and they put their signatures as guarantors. Despite that, the opposition perpetrated that coup, and these countries pretended they were not the guarantors. They were oblivious, and they threw it to the dustbin. And I'm not sure whether there is any knowledge in the United States about the guarantors and this agreement between opposition and the Yanukovych government. And instead of a political settlement, they supported the coup, they backed the coup. There was no point in that, actually, believe me, because Yanukovych agreed to everything, and he was ready for early election, and he he stood no chance to succeed, to win. Why then perpetrate this coup and all those victims? And why pose a threat to Crimea and launch an operation against Donbass? I cannot understand that. I cannot fancy. This is the miscalculation of theirs, and the CIA did its part, played its part. One of the deputies of Secretaries of State said that they spent around $5 billion on that. But why do that? Why have they done that? It could have been done legally, legitimately, and without the loss of Crimea for them. And we wouldn't stir a finger. We wouldn't have stirred a finger had there not happened the developments, the bloody developments on Maidan. We back then agreed that after the collapse of the USSR, the borders would be as agreed, as stated, but we never agreed to an expansion of NATO or that Ukraine would become part of NATO. We never conceded and accepted that there would be NATO military bases there without any talks with us. We kept begging for decades, don't do this, don't do that. This actually acted as a trigger to the recent development, and with respect to the recent development, the leadership of Ukraine stated they would not abide by the Minsk Accords that were signed after the developments of 2014 in Minsk, with a plan laid out for peaceful settlement in Donbass. And the today's Ukrainian leadership, their foreign minister and other officials and the president said they didn't like a thing about the Minsk package of measures, and they would not stick to them. And the former leaders of France and Germany said that around a year ago, said in public, worldwide, that they had signed that agreement, but they had not been going to execute, to fulfill that. You know, they pulled our leg. I mean, have you achieved your aims?
No, at this point of time we have not, because one of the goals is the denazification, to denazify Ukraine. I mean, the prohibition of neo-Nazi movements in Ukraine. This is one of the issues that we discussed, that was brought up during negotiations in Istanbul last year, at the outset of last year. Upon our initiative, it was concluded, as the Europeans told us, that the context had to be established and provided for the final definitive signature of documents. And my colleagues in France and Germany told me, just imagine how are they going to sign this at gunpoint? You should move your troops, pull your troops back from Kyiv. As soon as we pulled our troops back from the Kyiv region, all of a sudden, straight away, our Ukrainian counterparts, our negotiators, threw all their accords and wasted them into the dustbin, and they got ready for a long-standing standoff and opposition, military opposition, with the help of the United States. This is how things develop.
Will there be talks, and why haven't there been talks about resolving the conflict in Ukraine, peace talks?
Well, these talks did happen, and they did reach a very high point of according our positions. It had been difficult, but these talks were almost finished. But once we withdrew our troops from Kyiv, the other side, namely Ukraine, simply discarded all the agreements that had been achieved, and it nodded an agreement following the orders of the US and the Western countries to fight Russia until victory. Moreover, the Ukrainian president introduced a legislative ban on having negotiations with Russia. He signed a decree that bans anyone from having talks with Russia. How can they have talks if he prohibited himself from doing that, and the rest as well? Yes, we do know that there are some ideas with regard to this settlement, but in order to come to an agreement, you need to have dialogue, right?
Well, the argument, I know you know this, is that, well, he invaded Ukraine, he has territorial aims across the continent, and you're saying unequivocally you don't.
Absolutely. No. I rule this possibility out. You don't have to be an analyst, because that goes against common sense, to get involved in a global war. Because a global war would push humanity as a whole to the brink of extinction. Yes, there are means of deterrence. That's true. They were making threats saying that Russia would use tactical nuclear weapons tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. But these are, well, it's just like a boogeyman for rank-and-file citizens to make the US taxpayers, the European taxpayers, to pay up for military action in Ukraine. And their goal is to weaken Russia as fully as possible.